Okay, so today we are going to look at one of the final kind of small grammar lessons that are this is also another important topic that we need to quickly cover off before the end of our English 037 class. So we're going to jump straight into it now. So this topic is called apostrophes versus contractions. Now apostrophes are the punctuation tool that we use to show ownership, whereas contractions are when we take a subject and a verb and we kind of blend them into one unit. Now, the reason that I put these two together is because sometimes there is some confusion between these two forms. So we're just going to quickly go through, talk about what they are, and cover off some basic examples. So first, let's talk about apostrophes. Now, apostrophes are the most common method that we use to show ownership. So let's look at some examples. So basically what the apostrophe is it's this piece here where you have this little punctuation mark. This is the apostrophe itself. So usually we use an apostrophe S to mark possession. So for singular possession, we put the name of the person or the noun that has ownership over the other thing. Then we add the apostrophe S, and then we add the thing that they own. So Mark's dog. So the apostrophe S shows that Mark is the owner of the dog. Example 2, what about when there are plural nouns that are owning the same thing together? So in this interesting little situation, there are two people named Bill, and together those two people named Bill own a house. So when there are two people with the same name who own something together, we put the S beside the original noun because it's plural, right? And the apostrophe gets moved to the outside of the S. So Bill's, plural, house. The two men named Bill own the house together. Now, some people think that it should be S apostrophe S, Bill's house, but we don't say it that way, and it's not correct to write it that way. So just be aware. Obviously, this is kind of a unique situation. We don't see it that often, but when it does occur, the apostrophe goes outside of the S. So finally, there are some names that end with S as well. So a classic example is Moses, and again, it's going to look similar to the plural version where we have Moses, apostrophe, and then tablet. Okay, so just be aware that for singular words that do not end in S, the apostrophe goes inside of the S. For plurals and for names that end in S, we put the apostrophe on the outside, but we do not add the second S because it's a little bit repetitive and redundant. We don't need it there, so don't add it. So that is the basics of what apostrophes are. They're just a very simple punctuation mark that help us to show possession. So now let's move on to contractions because we need to talk about these two, even though the topics are quite separate in terms of grammar. Because there is some overlap in the way they look, we need to talk about them at the same time. So that's why I clump these two different issues together. So I like to say that contractions kind of muddy the water here. They make things a little bit more challenging. So let's talk about that. So things become tricky when you add contractions into the picture. And what are contractions? Contractions are a short form of a verb, a subject plus the main verb when we mesh them together. So what does that look like? So here we go. Here's the classic. It is becomes it's. Now immediately you see why we need to talk about these together, because this looks exactly like that singular possessive marker, that singular apostrophe that we talked about earlier. So here's another example of a contraction. They are becomes their. Now, contractions are most commonly used when we're speaking, but we should still know how to write them correctly, okay? So let's take a look at the issue of the exception, and you may have already identified it, but we'll close it off very quickly and go from there. So there's always an exception to the rule, right? And we need to know the exceptions so that they don't cause us to make mistakes. So there's one sticky exception to the apostrophe / contraction situation, and it comes down to this example of it, right? So the possessive for it is just going to be its. Now you'll notice that the thing that's different here is we don't have that apostrophe marker here, right? So here's an example sentence, right? Look at its colors. So because the whole reason we write it like this is because the contraction form of it is what's causing the confusion here. So the contraction for it is, this is where we do write it's with the apostrophe S. And here's an example, it's a bird. So maybe these two sentences might go together, right? We might say, first we might say, it's a bird, and then we might say, look at its colors. Now, students will often ask me, okay, well, why do we decide to write this, the contraction, why does the contraction look like a possessive? And the simple answer is, this version, the it is, or the contracted form of it is far more common than this possessive of it is, or of its colors, or whatever. So even as I'm talking about it, you can see why this is an exception and why it becomes confusing. Basically, 90% of the time that we encounter one of these two, it's going to be the contracted form of it is. So because it is so much more common, the language itself has determined that it's more logical for us to use this for the contracted form of it is, and to use a special form of the possessive for the word it. Because it's less common, we're just going to have it as the exception to the rule. So it's the one special case for apostrophes where you do not need the apostrophe to mark possession. And it's the only case that I've encountered that is common enough for us to talk about and to close off. Okay, so there will be one more point here. Remember this exception to avoid errors in your writing. And what I do, to be honest with you, is I will almost never use the possessive form with the word it, just because if you never use it, you avoid the issue altogether. You will find that sometimes you will want to use the contracted form of it is, and that's fine. You can go ahead and use it. Just remember, you write it like this. Okay, so I will attach a little worksheet to this mini lecture that will give you some practice in first identifying errors connected to apostrophes, and then in writing some of your own sentences using apostrophes to mark possession, but also making sure that you can avoid this one sticky exception.